class, I promised you guys a video of some tips and tricks for rubber dam. So I wanted to just take a minute to kind of talk through a couple things here. So one thing that you'll know when you are placing a rubber dam is that the more you do it, the more you will learn your own little tricks and things that work well for you. Like I said, I have placed many rubber dams, and first of all, I don't usually use this little chart, or some offices will have like a stamp that stamps this pattern on the rubber dam. I don't use it because I actually think that the holes in these diagrams are a little too far apart. That creates a larger septum in between the teeth, and sometimes that wide septum can be kind of hard to floss, especially on a human patient. So I tend to not go by these little diagrams. I punch my holes a little closer. That gives us a narrower septum, which can help with the flossing. The one issue you can run into is if you punch them too close and those septums are too wide, you risk breaking the dam because there's not enough material in between the teeth, and it can overstretch. And you can also get leakage if they're too small as well. So it's kind of like finding a fine balance between those two. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to place a new rubber dam today, and I'm going to place this one on the maxillary teeth, and I'll show you how I punch for the maxillary. We also kind of talked about a little bit that, there are standards for which holes you should use for which teeth, but you can also play with that as well. I tend to go by the standard. One thing I will sometimes do is I will punch my the hole for my clamp. I'll actually punch a double punch for that one. So I'm going to go to about 2 inches from the edge. I'm going to use the largest hole, and I'm going to punch. And then I like to kind of make like a little Venn diagram type of a thing. That's what it reminds me of. But I punch 2 holes that are right next to each other like that. It gives me a much larger hole, which is on a patient. If you can imagine you're trying to stretch this in their mouth around that clamp in the very back of their mouth, this just makes it a little bit easier. And I've found the larger hole doesn't tend to give me too much leakage or anything like that. It works out really well. So that's just something that I personally do. That's not the norm. So then I do use the second hole for the molars. So I'm going to go ahead and punch the molars. My septum's going to still be kind of wide between the hole for the clamp and the first molar, but I'm going to show you what it's like if you're punching them a little closer together. Then I'm going to go ahead and go to premolars. And then I'm going to punch the canine, and I'm going to use the same hole for the central. And then I'm going to come back and punch in between those two for my lateral. And so you can see I've kind of created a curve. I've kept my punches, they're a little bit close to this edge, but I've kind of kept them in this upper quadrant here so that there's going to be some material that goes over the patient's top lip, but then plenty of material to cover the mandible. So you just want to make sure if you're not using the guide that you keep it in that quadrant and kind of pretend that you have this guide centered there. But you can see when you compare my punches to the guide, I'm working in a much smaller arch and my septums are much narrower, which may help in placing this on my Typodont. So I am going to get my clamp. I have not tried this one on this Typodont yet, so I'm going to go ahead and just try it on to make sure it is a good fit first. Ooh. Yeah, that one's actually kind of big. It's popping off. Let me switch to another one here. Okay, now I've got one that is a little bit smaller in size. Let's give this one a try. Yeah, that's a much better fit. Nice and snug, doesn't feel like it's gonna fly off. I've got my bow towards the distal. I've got my ligature tied. And then I'm gonna go ahead and get my rubber dam placed. So again, you can do it by placing the dam on the clamp and then the whole thing on, but I personally like to put the clamp on, make sure it's secure, and then go in with the material. So I get it over the entire tooth and clamp. And then I want to make sure first, I can see that my hole is stretched all the way over this tooth. So I need to make sure that septum gets down in between those two teeth. When I'm working with a rubber dam, sometimes you'll need to use an explorer to grab material and kind of move it into a direction, but try to avoid using the explorer. Even something like a spoon, the edge of it can be kind of sharp, and you can, if you're really pulling on your material, you can kind of rip it or poke a hole in it. So I like to use the Greg when possible because it's a nice blunt edged instrument. So now you can see I've got the material kind of down between that tooth. So now I want to floss. Oh, actually, before I floss, I'm going to place my frame. It's so different when you're working on a typodont than on a human. You kind of forget some of the steps. Okay, so I'm putting the frame on because that's going to help me kind of get some of that material around out of the way. I'm not going to stretch it too much. I'm not going to like pull the frame super tight because I want to be able to manipulate this material a little bit. Okay. So then I'm going to use my fingers to just kind of spread it around the tooth. Now you can see that there's this material up here between these two teeth. And what I like to do is I like to take my floss and kind of place it on top of the rubber dam material. And I'm going to use the floss to push the material distally and down. So I'm trying to go right on top of the rubber dam material to help push it down to get it in. What I don't want to do is, let's see, let me stretch this one here. What I don't want to do with the material is I don't want to come from the top and just go straight down. I like to come from the occlusal and really push the floss down one way or down the other way. So I'm kind of like putting the floss on the cusps and then really hugging the surface of the tooth as I go. A lot of times what will happen is if you're just trying to shove the floss straight down without coming from the side, if you try to shove it straight down, a lot of times I notice that you have to put a lot of force on it, and people can actually make holes in their rubber dam that way and break it. So I like to kind of come from the cusps down in both directions to get it on. And again, I think I kind of have the luck of the typodont on this one because this is a very, very easy typodont. It's got some tight contacts, but overall, it's pretty easy to do on here. And at the midline, get that down. Okay, let's take a closer look at this. So I'm looking through the embrasures to make sure that the rubber dam material is not caught in any of the contacts and that it's down all the way around the gums. Remember to take your Greg, and your goal is to try to get that material inverted underneath itself, and that'll help prevent leakage and make for a nice working area. Okay, now I'm going to see if I can take this off without ripping it. Let's see if I can make myself run into any problems if I try to do this on the other side. Okay, so I pulled my rubber dam material off, and overall it's not too bad. This front hole is ripped. If this was on a patient, I would definitely need a new piece of rubber dam because I don't want that tear, because most likely what's going to happen is it's just going to tear more when I put pressure on the rubber dam with the HVE after it's in place, and then it's just gonna tear on me. But I'm gonna use this just for example now, and I'm gonna try to place it now on the opposite quadrant and just see if that side is any different, and if I run into any problems I can kind of troubleshoot through. So I've got my clamp on. I'm gonna stretch the material around. I've got to get it down through that very back contact. And then also when you're flossing for a rubber dam, I always like to make sure that on my left hand, I'm right-handed. On my left hand, I have just a tiny bit of floss wrapped around my finger, and then the bulk of the floss is out the right hand. That way, when I floss down and I go to pull it out, I only have a short piece of floss to pull out, and I'm not, pulling the floss out forever. So just another thing you'll learn over time that helps to save time. And so again, instead of just kind of popping it down through the contact, I'm going to kind of come up on the tooth, hug the tooth as I come down, and then pull out. On a human patient, it would never stay like this because of all the saliva. Okay, so I need to get it down between this contact. There we go. And remember, if you go through, like let's say I am trying to get it down between these premolars. So I'm gonna start by coming over onto the second premolar, and I'm gonna kind of curve that floss against the mesial and push. Let's say the rubber dam material does not go all the way down. I'm not gonna pull the floss out yet. I'm gonna come loop this over. So now I have the other end. Then I'm gonna come to the distal of the first premolar, and I'm gonna do that same thing. So I'm gonna hug the distal and go down. So I'm pulling the floss against the distal to try to help feed it down there. Okay, and then let's get this front one down. Put my frame on. Yep, that's upside down because it's not gonna go like that on a patient. The bow goes the other way. But what I wanna show you is, remember that spot where I took this rubber dam off and I reused it and it had a little rip? So that's what it looks like. So it's already, because there was that little rip, it made that hole larger. And so that's what happens, is you actually can get a gap, and that's where saliva can leak and things like that. So that's something that you don't want right there. My hole I can also see through right here on this, between the clamp and the second molar. What I would try to do here is just see if I can maneuver the material to kind of cover that space for me. Oh, and then the other thing about if you punch the holes and they're too large, when you put a rubber dam on, what you then do is your dental assistant is going to be taking their HVE or their high volume evacuator, and they're going to press down and be pulling on this material to create a well in the back of the patient's mouth. And so there's a lot of pressure being put on this. And see, like, the more that you pull it, you can create these little gaps. So the smaller your holes are, the less likely you are to have those little gaps, and then you can put more pressure on the rubber dam material. So, all right, well, I don't know if this is helpful or not. I mean, I hope that it was. Unfortunately, like I said, I have the luck of a better typodont today. But let me know if you're having any issues with anything, and maybe we can walk through it together.